Today, I'm going to be talking about A Closed and Common Orbit, which is a 2016 novel that was written by Becky Chambers. A Closed and Common Orbit is a really fantastic novel, and in my opinion, it's one of the best science fiction novels, ever. And I think that may sound strange, but I don't really care. A Closed and Common Orbit is a masterwork in so many ways. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let me quickly describe the novel. So, A Closed and Common Orbit is actually a sequel. It's a sequel to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which is a fantastic novel that came out in 2014. I actually made a video about it if y'all want to check it out. I'll put a link in the description. But anyway, A Closed and Common Orbit is actually a standalone sequel, so you don't need to read The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet to understand what's going on. But, like I said in my other video, I highly recommend reading it, even if only for its own value. But, back to the point. A Closed and Common Orbit centers around two characters, Sidra, an AI living in an illegal robot body, and Pepper, an engineer who sorta shows Sidra the way. And I'm being deliberately vague here because I don't want to spoil anything. So, Sidra is a ship AI who was put into a robot body, and Pepper was actually a clone who escaped captivity with the help of another, much older ship AI, this time actually in a ship. And, much like The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, A Closed and Common Orbit really isn't about anything else. It's about Sidra and Pepper, and it's a character study, a dual character study actually. And because of that, I don't think I can say much more without spoiling something. Alright, so back to what I was saying before. A Closed and Common Orbit is a really special novel, and like I said, a masterwork. It's interesting, it's well written, it tells a cool story, it asks some cool questions, and it exists in a fairly unique space artistically. So, yeah, it's pretty special. And I want to talk about that, but I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm just going to keep it simple and talk about the two things I think make A Closed and Common Orbit so special. So, the first thing I think is special is how the fictional world of A Closed and Common Orbit is put together, otherwise known as world building. I've talked about world building before, but let me get into it a little bit. As we all know, every character in every work of fiction exists in a world. That world is defined by the author in a way that hopefully complements the characters they've created and the story they're trying to tell. But in reality, most stories don't do this. Instead, they exist with their characters sort of in front of the world, not within it, and the world is left mostly overlooked. A Closed and Common Orbit is special because Becky Chambers is really good at world building. In a Becky Chambers novel, you're not just learning about characters, you're learning about worlds and cultures and possibilities, and the characters exist within these worlds and cultures and possibilities, not in front of them. What I'm saying is the world is defined in a way that completely complements the characters and the story that is being told. Nothing is overlooked. And it just feels right. It feels proper. It feels like a story worth reading, not because it puts the reader in front of its world, but because it transports the reader into its world through its characters. That, in and of itself, is definitely special. And now, the second thing I think is special is the actual structure of the novel itself. Despite everything I've just said about the world building, A Closed and Common Orbit is actually a character study, a dual character study. This is interesting even alone, but the actual structure of the novel supports the dual character study so incredibly well that it's definitely worth talking about. Let me explain. So, The novel is structured in chapters, with each chapter alternating between our two characters, Sidra and Pepper. Sidra's chapters follow her at the present moment of A Closed and Common Orbit, and Pepper's chapters take place in the past as a set of flashbacks that get closer and closer to the present moment as each chapter goes by. So Sidra's chapters are the current timeline, and Pepper's chapters are flashbacks moving forward in time to catch up with the current timeline. And it just keeps going on like this. Sidra, Pepper, Sidra, Pepper, Sidra, Pepper, and then right when it needs to happen, the two timelines intersect. The structure becomes narrative. You'll know it when you get there. And when I say it out loud, it probably doesn't sound that interesting or special, but it is. The alternating chapter structure completely supports the character study. The two timelines and time scales work perfectly to let the reader know that our characters can only be studied with the other as context. Sidra and Pepper, similarities and differences. It's an incredibly smart and satisfying way to do a character study, and I don't think I've ever seen it done quite like this. It just feels special. So those are the two things, and I understand that what I've said here doesn't really paint a complete picture, and it's not supposed to. I guess I just wanted to highlight a really special novel by talking about a couple things it does really well. It does a lot of other things really well too. I'm just not going to talk about those things. You'll just have to take my word when I say A Closed and Common Orbit really is a special novel. It is one of the best science fiction novels I've ever read, and it is everything I've talked about here and more. You really have to give it to Becky Chambers for hitting another one out of the park. Like, seriously, there's a level of incredible craftsmanship and artistry on display here. The passion and thought that must have went into this novel is, like, unfathomable. So, shoutouts to Becky Chambers. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here. Because of everything I've just mentioned, A Closed and Common Orbit, is this incredibly rich and special experience. Like all of the best science fiction, it's accessible, interesting, and completely entertaining. I like that it holds a mirror up to society and actually has something to say about the reflection. And I like that it does something really cool and interesting with its structure. It's good, is what I'm saying. I can compare it a lot to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet in that it is precisely the kind of science fiction that I would confidently recommend to anyone, whether they're someone who is new to the genre or someone who's eager to dive into the genre but isn't quite sure where to start, or even as someone who already reads a ton of science fiction. It really is perfect for any audience, and I really can't recommend it enough.